so. No, 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 no. I don't think so. No, 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 no. It's never, ever, 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 ever gonna happen. I don't think so.
Hello, I'm Miss Andrea,
And I'm Miss Mare.
and this is CheesePress. So, this week on the social medias,
I was going to say, this topic is entirely from your feed.
there have been some fisticuffs over some very particular topics, a very particular topic in the homeschool world. And that topic is K-12 homeschooling education.
So you're going to need to define that for our audience, because we're not going to assume
Okay.
that they know what we mean when we're saying K-12.
And so the meme that started this full-on knockdown drag out was someone wrote 3 times, K-12 is not homeschooling, K-12 is not homeschooling, K-12 is not homeschooling. And some people got very offended
They did.
because they are using K-12 to homeschool. Here's the thing, K-12 is not homeschooling. Okay, so what happened was,
So what is K-12? Tell them what.
K-12 is online homeschooling by the Department of Education. Now, initially, it was made by people who wanted to offer something to homeschoolers.
Right.
But it was so good, it was so amazing,
Right,
that the public schools bought it. And that is how they administer public school at home. So, as I was saying, what happened was, back in 2003, because
Time for Learning.
was also a public school program that then, no, it was a homeschooling program that public schools then bought.
Right.
Because back in the early 2000s, when all these online homeschooling programs started happening, the public schools were like, oh, that's good. And then so they bought them. And the only reason that we have Time for Learning is because one man went and bought a license to it to license back to homeschoolers. And so the public schools saw this program that homeschoolers were starting to use, and it was amazing, and they said, mine. And they paid a lot of money to pull that into public school because they understood that they were in competition with homeschoolers for a good online education.
Right.
Because at that time, things existed like ACE, Christian Education, Accelerated Christian Education, and Lighthouse Homeschool, and all these very homeschooly brands. And these are very standards aligned.
Right.
And so while they weren't initially made for public schools have all licensed them and own them. You can find them outside of the public school system, but if you're using K-12 or Georgia virtual school or any California virtual school, New York virtual school,
Right,
that's public education. What specifically makes it public education? You don't have to register as a homeschooler.
right,
When you go to pull them out of public school and put them into these schools, it's just a transfer. You, the parent, are never in charge. If your child misses days, the truancy officer is calling. It's public school.
Right.
At home,
on the computer.
but it's public school.
Right.
And it's not that different from what was happening during COVID, which we dubbed COVID schooling.
Right.
Because here's the sticking point that I never got my point across, because they were duking it out over, well, I do it and it's homeschooling. And don't you understand definitions? Absolutely. But you're missing the operative word. It's not just school at home. It is public school at home.
So the key difference and why this matters, because this controversy would not have meant anything if there wasn't an underlying point or an underlying issue.
Mm-hmm.
When you homeschool your child, at the end of the day, the person writing the grades, the person writing the transcript, the person writing the diploma is the parent. That's homeschool definition.
And so I'm sorry, the reason people were getting annoyed,
right,
is because there's this huge segment of people in this homeschool group using K-12 and then coming into the homeschool forum to ask homeschooling questions.
Right.
And getting mad because we don't have answers for them. Don't ask me for extras. Don't ask me for freedoms. Don't ask me for laws. You're outside of this system.
Right.
It doesn't compute. Those things don't go together. Now, do I see a place where those two things can converge? Yes. But first, you must understand that what you're asking us for are extracurriculars in the homeschool world.
Right. Which are entirely okay. Your child can be attending public school at home.
And because of their schedule.
And have time for clubs and extracurriculars and things like that within the homeschool community. And then that's going to be what we call hybrid schooling.
Yes.
It's a type of hybrid schooling.
Mm-hmm.
And there are a lot of terms around all of the various educational options at this point. Because there are so many different options. There's no wrong way to... No, there are wrong ways to do this.
At CheesePress Publishing, we create educational curriculum and content, beginning with history. This is the first 3 of 8 books of our ancient history curriculum. We should be done getting them all published by February.
That is the goal.
This first one is very much a standalone because it teaches you how to teach and study history.
There are so many right ways to do this now. And so there are so many different ways that you can piecemeal different things together. If accreditation is important to you, there are all kinds of accredited programs that...
But I am first to say, I've always been first to say, if you're pulling your kids out because they're being bullied, there's something going in school, and you need to just remove them in that moment, and you think you're putting them back, then you need to be doing public school at home, especially if they're in high school.
Yep.
So we don't have a problem with public school at home. We have a problem with you not using the right phrasing and then coming to homeschoolers for your fixes, because frankly, we don't know.
Yeah,
that is public school.
We can't fix an online program like that because people who are homeschooling aren't using those systems.
So I personally have tried to use the systems. When my oldest needed physics, look, I wasn't learning it. I was done. They were senior and I wasn't doing it. Was it physics? No, it was calc. Also, something I'm not doing. It was physics and calc. And so I signed him up for that. And I looked at the younger child and said, Spanish too? No comprende. So I used the Georgia Virtual School, and I signed them each up for a class in the fall. And they had to be online at a certain time with the teachers. It was a scheduled class back then. Now it's not scheduled classes per se.
Yeah, some of them are asynchronous.
Right. And so I contacted both teachers and said, we are homeschooled. We are taking these classes as homeschoolers, and my children are taking a week to go compete in a homeschool competition for choir and theater monologues. And they're both like, great, knock it out. I get back, and they've done what homework they can do in that situation. I get back, and both teachers are like, what made you think you could take time off? This is public school. Perhaps the conversation we had going in, right? And then my kids are used to studying, and here's the kicker, and here's what we need to understand. My kids were used to studying an hour per day per course. And that generally does it for everyone. But when the government looked at how homeschooling works, when they looked at the child not being in the class, the child being in the class is called seat time. The child not being in the class is called not seat time, right? And so seat time versus, I guess, face time. I don't remember the phrase I used.
Seat time versus it's your homework.
Whatever. So they decided.
I get the term for it.
Me too. They decided that if you don't have seat time in the classroom, then you are missing something, and so therefore you had to double your online time. Seat time versus online time. You had to double your online time. So they would give extra work. They would give busy work to give you 2 hours of assignments versus where normally you would have 1 hour of assignment. And so what they said to me is to get an A, and I think it was a Spanish teacher, to get an A in this class, your child will need to spend 2 hours a day, 5 days a week. So what if they had a full course? Math, science, history, the other thing, language arts, foreign language. 10 hours
a day.
That leaves no time for life. So while I do recommend that high schoolers who don't know what they're doing next year, definitely do online schooling. I would only do it for.
But now there are other options. Now there are other options because there are accredited programs.
There are.
And so if
A lot of them are still
reason,
looking at seat time crazy though.
Sure.
But the virtual schools and the K-12 are really
right.
set in their ways where that's concerned.
But if you're pulling out a child for a year because there's some kind of circumstance going on and you want them to not be behind, but you're putting them back into a schooling system, you definitely want to be accredited, because if it's not accredited, they're going to look at that sideways. Depending on the accreditation, some kids coming back after COVID
still
and even now they're still getting looked at a little sideways.
They're still kicking back out accreditation that they accepted.
Right. So
be aware of that.
Be aware that, and that's, I think, at the discretion of the principal.
Each school.
Every school. So that's entirely up to
So a school that may have said, we're going to take your children's accreditation, may come back at the end of that year or 2 years later and say, nope, they're going to have to test through this stuff that they took 2 years ago.
We do know of at least one instance in our local area where that has happened.
It's a little insane. And so K-12 is not homeschooling. Is it a tool that homeschoolers can use? Yes. Do I think you should use it for the entire course? No. I think that needs to be done only as absolutely needed. Because here's the other thing. Now, in addition to your homeschool transcript, if you do have a homeschool transcript, you also have a public school transcript. If there are any foibles on that public school transcript, too bad, so sad. Everything you did, you breathed out, you breathed in. Everything you did is on that public school transcript. Whereas in homeschool land, if your child takes a course and in college you decide this isn't going well, we're going to go ahead and drop it and try again later.
Yeah.
You lose so much of the freedom of homeschooling when you use K-12 or your state's virtual school program. Are homeschoolers mad about it? Not really. But please don't come to us to help you fix it, because we don't know. And don't get mad at us when we say, but that's not how it works.
Right.
Because it just isn't.
That's not how that works.
Okay. Anything you got to add to that?
Well, do we want to talk about other methods of homeschooling? Because we kind of mentioned hybrid schooling here.
Yes.
For a minute.
We did.
And so.
Hey y'all, this is Miss Mare.
And this is Miss Andrea.
And we're with Hazelwood Prep.
We want to remind you that Georgia gives on Giving Tuesday.
The mission of Hazelwood Prep is to foster an inclusive educational community that inspires excellence. We blend language arts and history, and we track math with science in a hybrid learning environment.
We teach through the arts and house a fantastic theater program.
Find us and other Georgia nonprofits at gagives.org and consider giving.